Good afternoon. Welcome to panel 4, Envisioning Evidence, of the American Philosophical Society's week-long symposium on evidence, the use and misuse of data. My name is Adrianna Link, and I'm the head of scholarly programs of the APS Library and Museum at the American Philosophical Society. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that although we are meeting virtually, that the Society and what is now the city of Philadelphia physically rests within the Lenape-Hoking. We honor and recognize the past, present, and future generations of Lenape people who call this region home. I would also like to reiterate that Black Lives Matter. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 for the promotion of useful knowledge, and has long engaged in that work. Election to membership honors those who have made significant contributions to science, arts, and humanities, as well as public life. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. The Society supports research by providing over $1 million in grants and fellowships a year, especially to younger scholars, including several of the presenters who will be speaking on this panel today. Given the many different ways that our founder, Benjamin Franklin, used evidence and information in his scientific research, publishing, and diplomatic work, we felt that this week's conference on the use and abuse of data in the past, present, and future would be particularly fitting. I'm excited to moderate today's conversation on envisioning evidence. But before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to quickly go over the format for the session. Each presenter will speak for 8 to 10 minutes about their work. And a reminder that the full papers are available on the conference website and can be accessed using the password evidence2020. And we'll make that the link to those papers available to you in the chat. After the presentations, I will begin our conversation with some general observations and questions, and then we'll turn it over to you, our audience members, to get you involved with our conversation. In order to do that, we ask that you please use the Q&A feature that is located at the bottom of your screen, right at the bottom on your taskbar, in order to submit questions. And we encourage you to do this at any point during the panel today. So if you think of a question while another presenter is presenting, that's fine. It won't disrupt anything. Please feel free to ask your questions. We also encourage you to continue the conversation online on social media using the hashtag #APSEvidence. So let me introduce today our speakers. Let me bring up their bios. Okay, so today's speakers are Alexander Campolo, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Stevanovich Institute on the Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on connections between the history of computing and the history of the human sciences, looking at technologies that produce data and the forms of knowledge and expertise that mobilize them for scientific and political ends. In 2017, he received the APS Library and Museum's Leon and Joanne V.C. Knopf Fellowship to support this work. His paper today is How Not to Analyze Data, John W. Tukey against the Mechanization of Statistical Inference. Next, we have Nicholas Barron. Nick is a historical anthropologist and the 2016 APS Phillips Fund recipient, whose research examines the intersections of the social sciences and indigenous political formations in the United States Southwest. He currently teaches at Mission College and will spend the summer as the William Y. and Nettie K. Adams Summer Scholar at the School of Advanced Research. His paper today is titled, Aren't We Kind of Splitting Hairs? Reframing the Pascua Yaqui tribe and the Anthropology of Edward Spicer in the United States Congress. Finally, we'll hear from Jaco de Swart, who is a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam, researching the history of contemporary cosmology. He studies how the field of cosmology came to be a genuine empirical science of the universe in the second half of the 20th century. He has been a visiting researcher at Princeton University, Tartu Observatory, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and has been awarded the American Institute of Physics Grant and Aid for oral history and interviews. His paper today is How the Universe Went Missing in 1974. And Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you while I share my screen and get your slides up.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So first, I'd like to thank Adrianna, Kyle, and everyone at the American Philosophical Society in a double sense. First, for organizing and then reorganizing this very timely event. And second, I want to acknowledge that the APS very generously supported this research with a fellowship to work in their library where Tukey's papers are held. You can go to the next slide. In this talk, I'd like to bring out some of the core themes of the paper, which is available to download in full. The first concerns historical debates about its more immediate context. I'm interested in what the career and thought of the statistician who you see pictured here can tell us about objectivity, evidence, data, and statistical inference in the post-war or Cold War social sciences. The paper is framed around what scholars like Gerrit Gigerenzer have referred to as an inference revolution in this period, where a wide range of sciences were transformed in the image of a set of techniques, sometimes grouped under the name null hypothesis significance testing. And if that doesn't ring a bell, you can think of p-values as a sort of emblematic shorthand. A second set of implications concerns some broader epistemological and political questions about data and evidence as we move from the mid-20th century toward the present. Initially, when I was doing this research, I was thinking about applications like machine learning, fields like data science and artificial intelligence. And can you go to the next slide, please? But during the pandemic, I imagine many in the audience, have been following the public discussion around epidemiological models. And I've been really struck by, although perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, by their intensely politicized interpretations. Next slide. So my interest in Tukey came out of a larger project on the history of data visualization. And the sort of guiding idea of this work is that a new form of empiricism emerged out of a somewhat unexpected source, which was the spread of digital computing during the second part of the 20th century in the sciences. To risk simplifying this context massively, all I'll say is the intuitive, and I don't think by any means inaccurate interpretation of this period, is that computers transformed how actors conceived of calculation, data, and at the limit, thought itself. This is a kind of Weberian story of rationality pushed to extremes. Judgment and human expertise might be supplanted by these calculative techniques and technologies. Next slide. But as I worked through my archives and including at the APS library, I came across a heterodox group of thinkers who began to emphasize the limits to both computational calculation and in turn human cognition, ranging in areas from cognitive psychology to statistics and data analysis. These thinkers by no means rejected the dominant algorithmic rationality of the period, but they believed that it couldn't be sufficient in the sense that these forms of mechanical calculation alone would not solve our scientific or political problems. Instead, this dissenting group argued that these new massive scales of data, or as they probably would have put it, information, needed to be somehow opened to human judgment, intuition, and even perception in order to grasp unexpected relations, generate new hypotheses by, as Tukey put it influentially, exploring data. And I would say he's best known today for works like exploratory data analysis, which was published in the late 1970s. Next slide. But the case studied in this paper analyzes an earlier episode into Tukey's career, stemming from his contact with behavioral scientists at the Stanford Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences during the late 1950s. As perhaps an unusually thoughtful statistician, he sensed dangers in the ways that statistics might be misused in the social sciences, hence his and my title. And you can see his reference to Kipling's notoriously racist apologetic to colonialism might ironically capture some of the imperial ambitions of these fields. I should admit that few researchers at the time heeded the warnings that Tukey laid out here. But the reason that I think it's worth going back to his research is that many critics of what's more recently been called the replication crisis are precisely looking back to his work. More broadly, I'm interested in how Tukey spoke quite explicitly about deeper epistemological values and conflicts that were subsequently covered over in the mechanization of inference. And this work, draws on research on objectivity by people like Theodore Porter, Lorraine Daston, and Peter Galliston. Next slide. So what were these alternative values regarding data and evidence? How did they go beyond kind of technical debates about statistical techniques to more fundamental epistemological orientations? The paper draws out a few overarching themes. First, Tukey argued that the purpose of using statistics to quantify the strength of evidence should not be to sanctify results, to close them off from discussion. Instead, he argued that statistics should be used, in his words, incisively, or to dissect data, to look for unexpected relationships. And I'll just say these perceptual metaphors were not incidental. Second, significant tests problematically reduced interpretations of evidence into a binary decision, significant or not significant. Tukey, and many have followed him in this respect, argued instead for a plurality of tools for evaluating data and evidence, capable of grasping magnitudes and ranges rather than pushing decisions into binary categories. And this valuation of pluralism extended from techniques to the political role of experts. Tukey, and I think this is somewhat surprising in this period, argued that we might encourage statistical experts to offer different perspectives on the same body of data, to disagree. He even affirmed that we need to, quote, attack the fetish of objectivity, the fallacy that to a single body of data there corresponds an appropriate analysis. And finally, Tukey argued that instead of relying on mechanical mathematical procedure in the analysis of data, statisticians needed to become comfortable with flexibility, pragmatism, and perhaps even a degree of arbitrariness in order to, as he said, tune our ideas to what the data are trying to say to us. And again, I want to underscore the kind of empirical receptivity in his language here. Next slide. There's a lot we could say about each of the above epistemic conflicts, but ultimately what I want to bring out are the sources of these values in Tukey's work. So one conclusion that I draw is that Tukey's affirmation of judgment and pluralism as opposed to the enforcement of consensus through impersonal statistical procedures stemmed from his highly elite status in both scientific and political worlds. This is not, I don't think, the more democratic trained judgment that Daston and Galliston describe in the same period. And more for the present, I wonder how tensions between elite forms of expertise and judgment and the community enforcement of standards of knowledge are going to be negotiated as data collection and analysis becomes highly networked and distributed. All I can say is that while judgment, and I think this was very importantly affirmed by our keynote speakers, is hugely important, historians of quantification like Porter have taught us that it can be quite politically fragile, right? And I think we can just look around us for evidence of that. It's easy to support personalized expert judgment, I think, in the abstract, but I want to be lucid about its limitations in the face of political conflict. A second, this is, I think, ultimately more interesting, unifying theme in Tukey's arguments about the proper use of statistics in the behavioral sciences was grounded in his own historical understanding of science. And I'd say this is a kind of unusually direct moment where the history of science explicitly informed the politics of judgment and expertise. Briefly, Tukey embraced a comparative and even critical historical perspective. He asked scientists in younger fields like the social sciences to look not at relatively finished or mature state of knowledge in fields like physics, their finished theories, which I think has been a common interpretation of the social sciences in this period. Instead, he advocated looking at the practices of the physical sciences when these fields were young. At these moments, the sciences tended to be much more open to the empirical pluralism for which Tukey advocated. However, once again, I want to point out that this awareness of a sort of temporal plurality nonetheless rests on a developmental and I would say unified understanding of the history of science, where different disciplines, although they might emerge in different times and in different contexts, will nonetheless develop and mature in the same manner as the sciences that preceded them. So I'll end here on this strangely reflexive suggestion that this type of historical interpretation can be a very powerful source of what Daston and Gallison term scientific selves, and it might be worth thinking about how scientists' self-understanding of their own histories can inform these epistemic commitments, especially as conflicts seem to be intensifying in our big data present. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Barron. Thank you all for joining us here today. I'd like to also reiterate my thanks to the APS, but also to Kyle and Adrianna for organizing such a wonderful symposium. The material that I'll be presenting today involves research that has been supported by, as Adrianna mentioned, the American Philosophical Society, but also the University of New Mexico, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and also the Edward H. and Rosamond B. Spicer Foundation. So with that, our conference theme asks us to consider, amongst many other topics, the interpretation and application of evidence in the shaping of policies and decisions. While such a theme is no doubt of critical relevance to a variety of fields, and I think the week's events in the symposium have really illustrated that quite well, I find a particular resonance in the history of anthropology and its relationship with indigenous peoples of North America. In the context of the United States, anthropology has long been called upon to aid in the adjudication of disputes regarding the political status of indigenous groups vis-a-vis the federal government. In the absence of a discrete documentary record, anthropologists and their ethnographic and ethnohistorical findings often serve as an alternative archive for those trying to make heads or tails of the complex mosaic that is indigenous history. Surely the anthropologists, with their superior training in social theory and qualitative research, are well positioned to translate their ample bodies of monographs, journal articles, and conference papers into judicial exhibits that might settle disputes between tribes and settler authorities without succumbing to the kind of historical hair splitting that the chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Native American Affairs, Bill Richardson, once decried. Or so we think. As is often the case, when the halls of the academy are made to run through the halls of government, what results is a macabre architectural calculus that requires the careful and selective reframing of scholarly work, as it is made to conform to a new set of standards and principles. The case of the Pascua Yaqui tribe, I believe, is instructive. First slide, please. In 1978, this group accomplished a seemingly impossible feat. Despite being the descendants of indigenous migrants from Mexico, a contingent of the Yaqui living in urban Tucson successfully lobbied Congress to be recognized as an American Indian tribe. The quest for formal acknowledgement of the Pascua Yaqui tribe, the name ultimately conferred upon this group, was a most unprecedented uphill battle. With cultural roots on what would be considered the other side of the US-Mexico border, the Pascua Yaqui faced contestation from a heterogeneous group of politicians, real estate developers, and other federally recognized groups who recognized the Yaqui as Mexican, not American Indians. Next slide, please. In their efforts to bring about this shift in political status, the Yaqui leveraged the expertise of their longtime ethnographer and ethnohistorian, Edward H. Spicer. In an interesting historical conjuncture, as he submitted a brief summation of his decades of research as evidence in support of Yaqui recognition, Spicer formulated his most definitive theoretical treatments of indigenous and ethnic identity, which he ultimately organized under the general concept of enduring peoples. Comparing Spicer's concurrent theoretical developments and his evidential testimony, my paper, the full paper, illustrates how nuanced and empirically driven scholarly conceptions of culture and history often dissipate in the face of, or the exigencies of recognition and other federal procedures. While his name may not carry the same historiographic weight of other American anthropological scions, such as Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Edward Sapir, or of course their progenitor, Franz Boas, Spicer cast a large shadow in the world of Southwestern anthropology, where his magisterial studies of the legacies of colonization and the acculturation of peoples is an obligatory point of passage for those seeking to better understand the region. Since beginning his dissertation research in the summer of 1936, the Yaqui of Pascua served as Spicer's primary case study. Over the course of his 40-plus-year career, Spicer continuously reassessed his conceptualization of the Yaqui and their ability to do the seemingly impossible. That is, to persist as a distinct cultural entity without succumbing to the proverbial American melting pot. Next slide, please. Near the end of his career and also his life, Spicer compiled his thoughts on the Yaqui into a final theoretically driven ethno-historical account. In the Yaquis, A Culture History, Spicer reconceptualized the group as what he called an enduring people. That is, a universal human type existing within the political unit of the state that persists in opposition to assimilatory forces. Enduring peoples, Spicer went on to write, are not necessarily pure inventions of modern states. In many cases, they have traceable pre-modern antecedents that precede the polities in which they reside. However, continuity between contemporary groups and their proto-national roots are never straightforward. Spicer acknowledged this as he rejected theories of cultural persistence that rely on vague invocations of race, homeland, or a way of life. Even language, a commonly accepted marker of historical peoplehood, at least in the popular imaginary, or we might say the romantic European Herderian imaginary, did not suffice for Spicer, especially when talking about the Yaqui. Quote, unquestionably, the Yaqui language has had continuous existence for at least 350 years, but it would be going too far to maintain that the speaking of the language is the essential or the only feature of Yaqui continuity. One would not have dealt with the full nature of the continuity if one omitted from consideration the fact that a majority of those who call themselves Yaquis in the Arizona barrios use Spanish by preference in their family and daily lives, and that many do not actually employ Yaqui at all. End quote. Rather, enduring peoplehood, Spicer argued, is honed through common understandings built around at least what he identified as 4 prominent categories of symbols: ethnic terminology, place names, sacred laws, and ceremonies. Explicitly invoking Ernest Renan, a foundational figure in critical examinations of nationalism during the late 19th century, Spicer implicitly joined a modernist historiography with an interpretation of ritual practice to argue that ethnic symbols must be enacted regularly by individuals to give them a palpability, thereby enabling the group to endure. While we can see that Spicer cultivated a dynamic framework in the latter stages of his academic writing, creating a path to a relational view of identity, his advocacy for Yaqui politics and the presentation of his research as evidence presented a noticeably different perspective. Next slide, please. In 1976, Spicer agreed to provide written testimony in support of the Pascua Yaquis campaign for federal recognition. Now, during the previous decade, Spicer had worked tirelessly with indigenous leaders to support the persistence of the community through a variety of tactics, including securing federal trust land and funds from the Office of Economic Opportunity. Despite early signs of success, the arrival of the Nixon administration and the curtailment of the war on poverty saw the drying up of federal dollars, leaving the Pascua Yaqui with very few options. In a last-ditch effort to maintain their existence as a distinct community, the local Yaqui leadership decided to pursue federal recognition through the passage of congressional legislation. While the tribe would not be entering the courts per se, they would still need to prepare exhibits capable of convincing federal officials that the Yaqui were equivalent to a Native American tribe. Logically, they turned to their longtime ethnographer and collaborator for assistance. Next slide, please. With prompting from the tribe's lawyer, Spicer submitted a succinct 2-page testimony in which he gave, now given his position as the foremost scholar on the community, at least at the time, and that he was simultaneously composing his analysis of what would become enduring peoples, Spicer was most certainly well positioned to speak to the variable symbolic and historical factors driving Yaqui identity. However, in the face of the limited political imaginary of recognition, Spicer's dynamic framework shifted to a more palatable essentialism. An instructive example can be found in the opening sections of his statement, where he says, quote, "One conclusion of my long and extensive study of the Yaqui is that they form a distinct Indian group or tribe. The language their ancestors spoke and the present-day Pascua Yaquis continue to speak is universally classified by linguists as a member of the Uto-Aztecan language family, and the present-day Yaquis, including those of Arizona, speak this same language, end quote. Juxtaposed with Spicer's comments from the Yaqui regarding enduring peoplehood, we can see that this narrative is a simplification of his own thoughts on the relationship between language and identity. Spicer would make similar shifts elsewhere in the testimony, which I reference in the longer paper available for download, when characterizing the Yaquis' connection to southern Arizona as an homeland, an autochthonous homeland. Next slide. Circling back to our conference's emphasis on the interpretation and application of evidence in the shaping of policies and decisions, the case of Spicer and the Pascua Yaqui suggests that the process of reframing anthropological findings for governmental audiences is, to say the very least, a fraught endeavor. Once committed to the Yaqui campaign, Spicer's attempt to reframe his research to support a new political subjectivity at the congressional level underscores the subtle yet consequential ways that the articulation of knowledge is made to facilitate politically expedient narratives. Just as Indigenous groups are forced to engage and traverse the ideological twists and turns of federal recognition, so too are the scholars who take up their cause. This is not to excuse anthropology of its complicity with acts of oppression, quite the contrary. It is to more empirically document how this complicity actually operates, not through abstract notions of textual authority, but through the actual encounters involving anthropologists, native peoples, lawyers, politicians, governmental bureaucrats in specific political terrains. And I'll go ahead and end there.
A very good evening. At least it is evening here in Amsterdam. I hope you can all hear me. I have no feedback. I think you do. Start my video. That's what I do. Look at this. Here I am. A very good evening again. My name is Jaco. It's evening here in Amsterdam. And I wanted to start off by asking you to check whether you still have your keys. Can you check if you still have your keys with you? I have mine right here. I have an awkward relationship with my keys during this lockdown. I actually lose them all the time, which is weird, I guess. But I think this question of when do you realize you've lost something is an interesting question. When do you realize you've lost your keys? Is that when you search for them, or is it when you actually need them because you go outside and you don't want to get locked out? When you lose something. So this is interesting, I think, at least an interesting question. But now imagine you did not lose your keys, but you've lost something else. Now imagine you've lost 85% of the universe. How do you realize that you've lost 85% of the universe? Now you might laugh at home, but this, I can tell you, is indeed the state of cosmology at the moment. So that 85% of the mass of the universe is thought to exist of what they call dark matter. And this dark matter is distributed throughout the universe, and we need it to make sense of the dynamics of the universe. And it's actually a very central concept in our understanding of the structure and evolution of the universe. And it has been already for 40 years. So, and that's where I come in. I think this is a very interesting question. How do people get this fantastical idea in the center of our understanding of the universe? Or to put it differently, I'm interested in how dark matter came to matter. So that is, I'm interested in the conditions in which the people started to get interested in the dark matter problem in the first place. Okay. Interesting. Now, let's open our textbook of dark matter. What we'll see is an answer to this question, that is, dark matter came to matter at the moment that we found evidence for dark matter. But of course, what's at stake here is exactly this question of evidence, and that's where I align with the theme of the conference, because we do not want to take evidence for granted. Instead, actually, we want to understand how certain objects became evidence for something else, how observations or ideas became evidence. And this formation of evidence is something I want to study, and specifically how this evidence then indeed construes or produces a new object of knowledge. And in this, my particular case, that is dark matter or missing mass. So, okay, I would like to show you then the following, that how two phenomena became evidence for dark matter only when they were translated into a new field, the field of cosmology, a new practice which arose in the early 1970s, and that is empirical cosmology or physical cosmology. Okay, so evidence. Here we go. Let me show you what you'll get if you open your textbook on dark matter. This is evidence for dark matter. If we look at clusters of galaxies, and we look at the movement of galaxies in clusters, these galaxies are moving very, very fast. And they're actually moving so fast that we need, for this cluster to be a stable entity, we need much more mass than that we're seeing. Hence, there should be unseen mass, which we call dark matter. We turn our page in the textbook, and we see another evidence for the existence of dark matter. That has to do with the rotation of galaxies. That is, you expect the rotational velocity of galaxies to decline if you go further and further and further out of the bulge where all the light-giving mass is. Instead, what we see is that this velocity on the outer edges of galaxies is very, very high. Hence, there should be extra mass to explain this. So these are evidence for dark matter, but as I want to show, evidence does not speak for itself. So let's turn and give you a hint of how these observations came to exist. So clusters of galaxies. So clusters of galaxies actually became a phenomenon with the use of post-war astronomical technologies like the Palomar Observatory Sky Survey. They found out indeed that clusters of galaxies are fundamental condensations of matter in space. But what they didn't know, and when they found out about this discrepancy, which they indeed observed, what they didn't know was the nature of these clusters. So it could actually also be the case that these clusters were exploding apart. So if you go, for example, to the International Astronomical Union Symposium in the early 1960s, it reads as follows. For any particular group or cluster, it seems at the moment to be very much a matter of taste as to which explanation is assumed to be correct. The explanation of this velocity in these clusters. And this indeed held for almost a decade. In the early 1970s, you see still a lot of different solutions and ideas to address this problem. Dwarf galaxies, black holes, different force laws, or instability of these clusters. So this cluster problem in the early 1970s was not at all seen as evidence for something specific. It was a matter of taste. Now, the other problem, the one with the rotations of galaxies, has a very similar history. That is because of post-war astronomical technologies, in this specific case, that of radio astronomy, new tools were used to study the outer edges of galaxies. And you here see the Westerbork Synthesis Radio Telescope in the Netherlands. And when they started to indeed study the observations on the outer edges of the galaxies, they found that the rotational velocity was actually very, very high. And this is what you see here, the velocity of rotation with respect to the distance away from the center of the galaxy. They had flat rotation curves. But the interpretation of these rotation curves didn't speak for itself at all. And actually, there were a lot of models, classical models, which could account for this data. So you read in these papers that extrapolation of this data, or extrapolation of mass, is clearly a matter of taste. So too, for this rotation curve problem, it was a matter of taste of how to use this data, how to interpret these observations, so they were not speaking for themselves as evidence for something. So then how should we understand this? How did the universe, or how did mass went missing in 1974? How did dark matter come to matter? So this happened in this paper, a paper written by 3 authors which had nothing to do with any of the communities, this extragalactic community or the community of radio astronomers. And they were interested in something very, very different. They were interested in the size and the mass of galaxies, but also in the mass of the universe. Dario Stryker, Jim Peebles, and Amos Yaqui were all at Princeton, and they were all of a new generation of astrophysicists combining these different disciplines in a new field that was arising in the late 60s, and that was physical cosmology. And cosmology was indeed, in a certain sense, reborn at the time. And what you see here, for example, and you can read more of these hints in my paper, you see here the amount of publications on cosmology in the 1960s, which increased tenfold in 10 years from 1965 onwards. In 1965, people found out about the cosmic microwave background and other observations that showed that people had to take into account the evolution of the universe to understand other scales in astronomy too. So indeed, in the early 1970s, you could speak of a rebirth of cosmology, that people started to take cosmology seriously as an empirical science which you could study physically. For example, what you see here is a textbook. Textbooks were coming out on cosmology, in this new type of cosmology in the early 1970s. This is a textbook called Physical Cosmology by one of the authors that I just mentioned, Jim Peebles. This one was from 1971. And a big part of this new type of cosmology was understanding the mass of the universe. Because the slogan goes, if you understand the density of the universe, you would know its destiny. If you know the amount of mass of the universe, it means that you know the amount of gravitational attraction that will counter the expansive force of the universe. So if you have a lot of mass, the universe would collapse again, and if you do not have a lot of mass, the universe would expand forever. And this what was at stake for cosmologists in the early 1970s. But there was something very specific about this, and this is interesting. And here you see this hybrid domain of cosmology using techniques of astronomy, physics, but even philosophy. One would particularly like to know whether there is enough mass to close the universe. And this was interesting. People had a very specific model of the universe that was interesting. And that is the universe where you have just enough mass for the expansion of the universe to be slowed down and to collapse again. This was a closed universe. And ideas on the closed universe go back to early work of Albert Einstein in the 1920s. So this was a philosophical idea about how the universe should look like. But what they were finding is not a closed universe. Actually, they were finding 1% of the amount of mass that you need to close this universe. So this new generation of cosmologists were asking the following question. Where can the missing mass be hiding if it is demanded on theological or other grounds that the universe is closed? So from cosmology, you can speak of indeed a missing mass, the amount of mass that you need to have this specific model of the universe. And this is how we should understand these authors, this new generation of cosmologists were interacting with these observations. Because they write, available evidence, so for them it was indeed evidence, indicate that measured masses of galaxies diverge with increasing distance. So they started to use these observations as evidence in the following way. Here you see it, they combine all these observations in a single diagram, which a scale which is far grander than the scale of any of these separate astronomical disciplines. So here you see the rotation curve data, you see the data from clusters of galaxies, and they show that mass is increasing with radius linearly. So there must be much more mass than that we're actually seeing from galaxies out to very big groups of galaxies. But this is not it. So here they indeed combine and they mobilize these different observations to show that there must be more mass, but they also mobilize this idea, this philosophical idea that there should be more mass, that there is missing mass. Because they write in the introduction of this paper, if we increase the estimated mass of each galaxy by a factor well in excess of 10, we conclude that observations may be consistent with a universe which is just closed. A conclusion believed strongly by some for essentially non-experimental reasons. So this is indeed again also the point I wanted to make, that these two phenomena, these rotation curves of galaxies and this problem in clusters of galaxies, they started out as certain observations which did not have a specific place within the astronomical discourse of the specific communities. They only became evidence for dark matter when they were translated into a new field, into a new practice, where different methods from astronomy to physics and even old cosmology related to philosophical problems were combined. And you can read more about these separate different arguments in the paper that is online. And to close off, perhaps then I can say what happened here, and for the universe to go missing, it had to be found in the first place. Thank you all for having me on your screen.
All right, I'm going to ask my panelists to please turn their videos on and unmute themselves. And Jaco, if you could unshare your screen. Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for these really interesting and informative presentations. I have to say, I really loved reading your papers, and I reread them a couple times as I was getting ready for today's event, and every time I got new details from them. So I really encourage our audience members to take some time. I think that there's more in those papers than was able to be conveyed as thoroughly in the short amount of time that we gave our presenters. So I'm going to offer just a couple of observations and general questions to get us started, and then I really encourage those of you at home to submit your questions as well. So these papers use three cases, namely John Tukey's Bad Manments, which is such a great word, and the critique of increased dependence upon statistical models and data within the Cold War behavioral sciences, Pascua Yaqui's inclusion of Edward Spicer's ethnographic work as evidence in support of their 1978 application for US federal recognition, and the accidental discovery of dark matter as a consequence of the cosmological search for missing mass during the 1970s, to consider the context and conditions in which scientific data is produced and used to identify and in turn stabilize particular scientific, political, and legal categories. And I thought it was funny that although the theme of this session is envisioning evidence, in reading the papers, I was really struck by how often other sensory experiences were invoked as critical to this process. So I'm thinking especially of Tukey's call to behavioral scientists to tune their ears to the plurality of data, as well as Jaco's description of clustered discrepancies as being a matter of taste. In the 1950s, and perhaps we can think about this and return to it later on in our conversation. But for now, there's a couple of themes that cut across these papers that I'd like each of you to consider as we start. So in all three of these papers, evidence about a particular occurrence, case, or scientific enterprise really only came into focus, was envisioned, or became legible when presented by an outside observer. So for example, Tukey being a statistician commenting on the methodologies of behavioral sciences, Edward Spicer being brought in by the Pascua Yaqui as an expert witness to testify on their behalf. And then of course, the group of emergent physical cosmologists that Jaco talked about who were working at Princeton in 1974, who were the ones who inadvertently discovered dark matter. So I guess one way I want us to start thinking together is how do the ways that evidence gets communicated, by whom and in what context, affect the establishment of particular scientific or legal categories? And does the production of data and of scientific expertise demand a reification through scientific practice? So in other words, does data and science only come into being through practice, or are there other kinds of causality at play? And then to build on that question, and on a question about trustworthiness that was brought up in the last session, I also want to bring up these calls for plurality that Tukey was making in his critique of the behavioral sciences. and think about how democratization and even decolonization of scientific practice, how those factors into your cases. So how might historians of science and anthropology, with our particular outsider perspective, kind of reflect on the positionality of our actors when thinking and writing about these different scientific and legal ideas and political ideas and how they come into being. So I'll stop there and let you sort of think about those questions, and we can encourage some from our audience as well. Anyone want to start?
Sure. I mean, I could say something, but I just want to say I think it's a great observation to think about the status and position of the various cases and actors that we were talking about. And to me, it also reminded me a bit of some comments made in the keynote about the role and position of experts, and also like the way that norms work in producing trust and things like that, right? So the keynote folks, I believe, said that, right, like expert consensus is good sometimes, but it also can inhibit new things or inhibit new discoveries, which I think is what we're all sort of concerned with. And just, you know, I'm not a political theorist, but I do like, just to sort of emphasize a couple of things in my paper, is that to me, it's just like it's an interesting tension, because Tukey almost criticized some of these mechanistic quantitative techniques from within. So from within these worlds, which I think perhaps allowed him to speak in a different way than somebody who didn't have his sort of like pure mathematical background not to. And I just want to caution, I find many of his values personally attractive, but I do want to caution against like making him a sort of model, right? I don't think it would be reasonable to expect large publics to be able to speak in this way. And I think sort of in addition to these kind of outsiders who are always interesting, we also need to balance, you know, democratic and egalitarian ways of evaluating data in complex, highly technical societies. You know, this is not a problem that I've identified or come up with, but I do think that thinking about these different positions is, and questions of status and power is really important for them.
Yeah, if I can just sort of add on to that, to Alexander's point, yeah, obviously thinking about the positionality of experts as sort of being an important component of where their expertise and authority is derived from. And I think it's really interesting to think about the example of statisticians, like people who are coming perhaps from so far within their disciplines that it actually enables them to see and talk about it in a different way. I think from my own work, when trying to think about how anthropology, you know, I think cultural anthropology is particularly perhaps not unique to the social sciences, but it does have a long-standing tradition of this sort of reflexivity and ability to sort of understand and sort of look back at its own history and its own positionality that's sort of a healthy and encouraged within the academy. My concern is what happens when that is brought outside the realm of the academy and made to operate in these other social settings. In the case in particular, these sort of legal or quasi-legal arenas where expertise is still very much important, right? Spicer, in my example, still has authority as being an academic that they can invoke, but really the categories that he's working with, that he's kind of trying to find ways to support, are not really categories of his own invention. And I think a lot of anthropology that works in the applied capacity can sometimes forget that. And it's, again, not to sort of absolve them of any authority that they might have, but especially when we're talking about a new arena, that has a new political terrain, you might be dealing with instances in which that expertise might not account for as much. So I think also thinking about this methodologically for historians of the sciences, I think part of the way also we account for that elitism, that privilege, that epistemological privilege, is by also not assuming that it exists right off the bat, right?
So I guess in my case, what's at stake is actually by the use of evidence that they were crafting an expert in a certain sense. So what's at stake is the authority itself. Who is a good cosmologist, and when are you a good cosmologist? because it wasn't clear at all what cosmology is, and people were still very critical of the whole enterprise. And that is a decade before the early 1970s, or let's say 20 years before that. Cosmology was written with philosophical questions on what were good ideas, how should you actually do a science of the universe. So I think by invoking evidence and invoking astronomy and physics in a certain sense, they were using the authority of other disciplines to make that they are experts in a new field. So what I see there is actually a struggle for authority in using these different or mobilizing these different elements.
Great. There's a couple of questions that are coming in that are talking about kind of the legacies of the cases that you're all looking at in your papers, and sort of thinking about you know, the implications of those cases for practice today. So there's one here from Bob Hauser. At the time that Tukey wrote about bad amendments, data sharing was both difficult and non-normative. Now it is easy and common and often mandated, and there has been a corresponding increase in alternative analyses of the same data. Could you comment on how Tukey might view current practice? But I actually encourage each of you to sort of think about how that might apply to your case. So Jaco, there's a similar question about what you think the probability that dark matter and dark energy will remain the best explanations 40 years from now. And then Nick, I would encourage you to think about you know, the implications of Spicer's approach to anthropology and kind of the legacy of applied anthropology in general, and how current anthropologists are thinking about the implications of their work. So whoever wants to start, sorry, throw a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, you know, these developments around data sharing, I think a couple of things to say about them. One is, you know, these new norms, I think we must acknowledge that they came out of a perceived crisis in a lot of these sciences that I think, you know, Tukey in some ways saw coming. You know, we can debate about like to the extent that he was heard. The only other thing is, you know, I certainly think these are salutary developments, but they're not like panaceas. And there's been some examples. I'm thinking particularly of like Paul Edwards' work in The Closed World, where the sort of public nature of data sets can be manipulated to sort of introduce a kind of like false scientific skepticism by doing like data dredging and things on that. So, and I'd say like the more general point to me is that I would say that even as we better formalize and enforce norms around data analysis, I don't necessarily think you can always address Tukey's concerns in that way, because I think he was really attuned to the singularity of individual studies, the subjectivity of researchers and things like that. So while I think these rules are important, I just don't think that they're a guarantee of that we can like sort of overcome these problems in this way.
Yeah, so this is very fascinating. And of course, the problem of dark matter is not solved yet, which makes it even more fascinating. And what is the case is that in the early 1970s, what happened there is that the dark matter as a problem was condensed because it was a problem. It was not yet a discovery because they didn't discover anything yet. They only discovered that there should be missing mass. By the 1980s, people came to be convinced that it should be a new type of particle. And there was a new optimism in the creation of a new field, which was astroparticle physics in the early 1980s. This made that there was a huge new research infrastructure. And now today, we still think that we should find a particle, a dark matter particle. And there are big, insane experiments doing this. But there's also an alternative to solving this dark matter problem. And that is to indeed let go of Newtonian dynamics, that the law of gravity is actually different, that dark matter is apparent matter. And so what would be the best explanation 40 years from now? I think this is exactly at stake at the moment in when is something a good explanation for dark matter. People talk about a crisis in dark matter research. When is something a good explanation? So that's also what I think is very interesting at what's happening at the moment in dark matter research. But yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the one to say something about the probability that they will remain the best explanation. But it is fascinating that there is so I have two supervisors, by the way. One believes that dark matter is a particle. I have a historian supervisor, two physicists. One believes that dark matter is a particle. The other one actually doesn't believe dark matter exists.
I will also try to respond to that line of question. I might have to shout over a dog that is waging a one animal war against the behemoth that is Amazon that continues to drop off packages in the neighborhood. So sorry, he's very committed to his campaign. But I think I have expressed similar trepidations when talking about sort of what this sort of historical view of, say, for example, applied anthropology might say for practicing applied anthropologists today, who I think are incredibly aware of the history of their discipline to a certain extent. And I think that it might perhaps speak more to those anthropologists that have taken an interest in the history of their own discipline very explicitly in their writing. So I'm heartened by sort of a new wave of scholarship that has gone back to the history of the discipline, kind of in response to what has been many decades of critiques, both of the discipline from within and from without, many of which are incredibly useful and well-founded, some of which kind of border on the facile. So I'm also thinking of sort of what Ira Bashkow has sort of recently characterized as taking a generous approach to the history of anthropology, recognizing that there's stories to be told, events that have occurred within the discipline's past that might be useful for practicing anthropologists today, not just applied anthropologists, things that are also theoretically quite useful. I see my work as sort of contributing to that. I would just suppose that I'm sort of if there's a party that is, the generous view of the history of anthropology, I'm sort of maybe perhaps the wallflower or the party pooper that is part of it as well, because I do have some trepidation around that. I think there's much that can be learned from the discipline's history that could potentially be useful for applied anthropologists. And I sort of reference that at the end of the written form of the paper. But I also would not want to see the history of applied anthropology reduced to some sort of instrumental story that helps us sort of sort the good from the bad so that we can do correct anthropology today. I think there's more important stories that can be told about the relationship between science and politics that stems from anthropology's past, but is by no means limited to it.
Great. So one other observation that I want to make too is, and maybe this is sort of thinking about the topic of positionality in another way, is the cases that each of you talk about are so localized. I actually think two of your papers are both kind of grounded in Princeton. So, which is, given that we're talking about the universe, we're talking about anthropology, and we're talking about statistics, the fact that Princeton emerges in both of them is there's some odds there. But I'm going back to the image that you showed, Jaco, of the textbook, and thinking about, when do these localized cases, these localized instances of the production of knowledge then get the credence, get the veracity, get the support to then make it into the textbook. So I'm wondering if there's something to be said about scale and objectivity, that once, it kind of goes beyond the local, the subjective, it's only when it emerges in the textbook that it becomes the objective. I don't know if you want to comment on those reflections.
So this is a very fascinating question. So this is kind of when does it something that people learn? When does it become a reified object in a certain sense that people can play with? And I think, and that's interesting in my case. So in the early 1970s, people still used the notion of missing mass. And actually dark matter only became used in the early 1980s. And this shift from missing mass, something being missing, to something that actually has identity or should be, is found and already should be filled in a certain sense. I think that's very fascinating. And that this shift in what people call dark matter candidates, and that's a notion that people started to use in the early 1980s, makes that this dark matter as a problem started to condense into literature and also into textbooks. But this was much later. But what then, I don't know, I want to give some ground to other people. What would be kind of the gist of this happening?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that it's an interesting question, and I think one of the problems identified in my paper is that the problem is almost opposite, in a sense that inference actually became problematic once a kind of reductive, standardized set of techniques and interpretations were packaged in a kind of textbook form. And you know, there's lots of debates about statistical education, and the ASA has talked about this as well. But it's interesting that I would say the lesson I would take from Tukey is that, you know, of course we need to teach these things in textbooks, but we also need to educate individual scientists capable of exercising judgment, sensitivity to the contexts of their situations, you know, capable of like creatively designing and interpreting experiments and things like that. So in a sense, it's almost a balance between a kind of like objective textbook and need to cultivate a kind of scientific subjectivity.
Nick, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I can kind of try to bring it into Spicer's his theoretical contribution that I mentioned, this idea of enduring peoplehood, which he has other terms that he uses it for. It is by no means, you know, a term or a concept that I think is universal in American cultural anthropology. I imagine most people are hearing it referenced for the first time. It's perfectly fine. But definitely in the Southwest, it's gained more institutional support, partly as a result of being woven into things like state museum exhibits as being sort of the guiding principle that defines those exhibits of indigenous communities. And even more recently, still just a book came out just last year on indigenous communities in the US-Mexico borderlands, invoked Spicer's theories of persistent peoplehood and enduring peoples. So it's really gained legitimacy and traction, I think, in the academy, but oftentimes very much divorced from the historical context in which it was produced. And once stripped of that context, I think it has a little bit more staying power, right? It's gone through that reification process where this is no longer a theory produced in real time, in real place, so much as it is potentially, you know, if it's used in a more reductive manner, I think in institutional settings, it could perhaps just be a kind of organic view of peoplehood, which I find to be quite ironic, because as I try to argue in the paper, Spicer's work, I think, is on some level almost presaging a type of modernist historiography and view of nationalism and ethno-nationalism. I don't want to go quite that far, but it's certainly talking about something that is more constructed, as opposed to, I think, how it tends to get used on the institutional level today, which is to talk about something that is a bit more primordial.
Great. There's a number of questions that have come in that are specific to each speaker, and for those who are looking for answers, I'm going to connect those questions with our presenters, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I'm going to take this opportunity to thank our speakers again for these wonderful papers and presentations, and I encourage all of you to join us again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our final session, which will look at data in the digital age, which will promise to no doubt pick up on a lot of the themes that we talked about today. So thank you all again for being here and for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also, again, there is in addition to the 1 p.m. session, there is a 3 p.m. wrap-up session. Thank you to Kyle Roberts for reminding me of this important detail. So thank you all again, and we'll see you tomorrow.